Picture this. You're flipping through your yearbook on the last day of school, reading cheerful messages from friends when you stumble upon a signature from someone you've never met. The message is simple but chilling. "I'll be seeing you again." Hours later, that same stranger is standing outside your house at 2 in the morning, and you realize they've been watching you far longer than you ever imagined. This isn't fiction. This is a real story, and it represents a terrifying pattern of behavior that educators and parents are only beginning to understand. Today, we're diving deep into 3 disturbing true stories that reveal a hidden epidemic in our schools: student-on-student stalking, obsessive behavior, and the warning signs that everyone missed. What you're about to hear will change how you think about school safety forever. These aren't just scary stories. They're cautionary tales with lessons that could save lives. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand the psychological profiles behind these predators, the red flags that went unnoticed, and most importantly, what you can do to protect yourself or someone you love. Story 1 Analysis: The Yearbook Stalker. Let's begin with Samuel Robinson III, a name that still haunts the person who shared this story. On the surface, this seems like a simple case of an awkward teenager with poor social skills. But when we examine the behavioral patterns more closely, something far more sinister emerges. Samuel's actions weren't random or spontaneous. They were calculated, methodical, and demonstrated a level of obsession that mental health professionals would classify as extremely dangerous. The first major red flag occurred when Samuel somehow gained access to the school on the last day despite being expelled weeks earlier. Think about what that requires. He had to plan his entry, evade detection by staff and security, and navigate through a building filled with over 1,000 students to find one specific yearbook. This wasn't impulsive behavior. This was premeditated stalking with a clear target in mind. The message he left was deliberately ambiguous yet threatening, designed to create fear while maintaining plausible deniability. "I'll be seeing you again" isn't overtly violent, but the implications are unmistakable, especially when you consider he had no prior relationship with his victim. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the level of information Samuel possessed about his target. He knew where the victim lived, details about their personal life, and information about their social circle that he had no legitimate way of obtaining. This suggests sustained surveillance over an extended period, possibly months. Samuel wasn't just observing from a distance. He was collecting intelligence, building a psychological profile, and waiting for the perfect moment to make contact. The fact that he chose the victim's home rather than a public space is significant. It demonstrates a desire to invade their most private sanctuary, to shatter their sense of safety in the one place they should feel most secure. The late-night visit reveals even more about Samuel's psychological state. He arrived at 2 in the morning, a time deliberately chosen to maximize vulnerability and fear. His initial approach through the storm door rather than the main entrance shows tactical thinking. He was trying to avoid alerting the parents while making contact with the teenagers in the basement. When he told them to come around to the back door, he was attempting to isolate his victims, to separate them from the relative safety of the house and any adult supervision. This is predatory behavior, plain and simple. The transformation we witness when Samuel is rejected is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire encounter. He begins with a cheerful, friendly demeanor, positioning himself as someone who just wants to connect. But the moment he faces resistance or criticism, particularly when David calls him a creepy stalker, his mask slips completely. The sudden shift to rage, the violent attempts to break through the window, and the deeply personal threats he makes reveal someone who has constructed an elaborate fantasy around his victim. In his mind, they had a relationship, a connection that justified his behavior. When reality contradicted this delusion, he reacted with explosive violence. From a psychological perspective, Samuel exhibits several markers of what experts call erotomania or Declarembault syndrome, a delusional disorder where someone believes another person is in love with them. However, his behavior goes beyond simple delusion. The stalking, the information gathering, and the willingness to use violence suggest something more complex and dangerous. He may have been suffering from a combination of attachment disorders, possibly stemming from childhood trauma or neglect, combined with poor impulse control and an inability to process rejection in healthy ways. The school's response, or lack thereof, is equally troubling. Samuel had been expelled, yet somehow his yearbook photo remained, and he managed to infiltrate the building on one of the busiest days of the year. This represents a catastrophic failure of basic security protocols. More disturbing is what happened after the incident. Despite police involvement and school cooperation, Samuel and his family essentially vanished. How does a family with a child, enrolled in a school with over 1,000 students, simply disappear without a trace? This suggests either deliberate evasion or a level of transience that raises additional concerns about Samuel's home environment and upbringing. The victim's lingering question, how did Samuel know where he lived, remains the most unsettling mystery. In today's world, there are numerous ways to obtain personal information, from social media to public records to simple observation. Samuel could have followed the victim home from school, searched online databases, or even extracted information from mutual acquaintances without arousing suspicion. The fact that he succeeded in remaining undetected until the yearbook message suggests he was careful, patient, and disturbingly competent at surveillance. This case teaches us several critical lessons about school safety and stalking behavior. First, expulsion alone is not sufficient to protect students from dangerous individuals. Schools need robust systems to prevent expelled students from accessing campuses, including photo identification requirements for all visitors and increased security during high-traffic events. Second, yearbook messages and other seemingly innocuous communications should be monitored for threatening or inappropriate content. While this creates privacy concerns, the alternative is allowing predators to use school-sanctioned channels to target victims. Third, and most importantly, students need education about stalking behavior and clear protocols for reporting concerning interactions, even when they seem minor or ambiguous. Story 2: Analysis: The homeless confrontation. Our second story takes us to a college campus and introduces us to a very different type of danger, one that emerges not from calculated stalking, but from impulsive aggression and the catastrophic consequences of antagonizing unstable individuals. Garrett, the protagonist's friend, represents a personality type we've all encountered. The person who confuses aggression with confidence, who sees confrontation as entertainment, and who fundamentally fails to recognize that actions have consequences. What happens when his behavior collides with someone who has nothing to lose becomes a cautionary tale about pride, privilege, and the thin line between safety and disaster. The initial confrontation at the crosswalk reveals multiple failures in judgment. When the group encounters the homeless man, their first instinct, to give him a wide berth and avoid engagement, is textbook crisis de-escalation. They recognize that someone exhibiting erratic behavior under the influence of drugs poses an unpredictable threat. They understand that their safety depends on not triggering a violent response. Everyone understands this except Garrett. His decision to verbally engage, to insult and challenge someone who is clearly not in a rational state of mind, transforms a manageable situation into a potential catastrophe. What's particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is Garrett's motivation. He doesn't engage because he feels threatened or because the homeless man has done something to provoke him beyond existing in their path. He engages because he can, because he perceives an opportunity to demonstrate dominance over someone he views as beneath him. This is classic toxic masculinity combined with a fundamental lack of empathy. Garrett sees another human being in crisis, and his response is not compassion or even neutral avoidance but active antagonism. He wants to humiliate, to assert his superiority, to show his friends that he fears nothing and no one. The decision to charge at the homeless man, causing him to flee, represents an escalation that any reasonable person would recognize as dangerous. Garrett has now moved from verbal provocation to physical intimidation. He has demonstrated to this unstable individual that he views him as prey, as someone to be hunted for sport. The group's laughter, including the narrator's admission that the scene was funny, reveals how privilege distorts perception. They're educated college students on the verge of graduation from a prestigious university. They have futures, opportunities, and support systems. The homeless man has none of these things. To them, his fear is entertainment. They cannot or will not recognize that they've just humiliated someone who has every reason to harbor resentment and limited capacity to process that resentment through socially acceptable channels. When the group realizes they're being followed, their response is again telling. Rather than recognizing the situation as dangerous and taking steps to ensure their safety, such as calling campus security or altering their route, they continue to heckle and provoke. They're emboldened by their numbers, their youth, and their inability to imagine real consequences. Garrett's second charge at the homeless man solidifies what has now become a deadly game. He has twice demonstrated physical aggression towards someone who is vulnerable, unstable, and increasingly desperate. The group believes they've won when the man flees again, but they've actually sealed their fate. The attack itself, when it finally comes, is both shocking and entirely predictable. The homeless man doesn't forget or forgive. He follows them home, waits for an opportunity, and attempts to kill the narrator with a rope. The method is significant. This wasn't a crime of opportunity with whatever weapon was at hand. The man brought rope, implying he planned to strangle his victim, a deeply personal and violent method of murder that requires sustained physical contact and effort. The rage evident in the attack, the clawing at the narrator's face, the determination despite being thrown to the ground, all of this speaks to how deeply the earlier humiliation had affected him. From a psychological standpoint, we're dealing with someone who likely already had compromised mental health due to homelessness, substance abuse, and the daily trauma of surviving on the streets. When Garrett attacked his dignity and sense of personhood, it triggered something primal. The homeless man's threats about calling a niche suggest either delusion or connections to other street populations who might assist in retaliation. His ability to track the group back to their house, to wait for the right moment, and to nearly succeed in his attack demonstrates that mental illness and substance abuse don't equate to incompetence or lack of intelligence. He was dangerous precisely because he had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The aftermath reveals systematic failures that extend beyond the individual incident. The hospital visit for disease prevention highlights the very real biological hazards of physical confrontation with someone whose health status is unknown. The police response, described as less than helpful, reflects the unfortunate reality that attacks by homeless individuals are often deprioritized, especially when the victims are privileged college students who will soon leave the area. The fact that the narrator had visible injuries in graduation photos is a permanent reminder that actions have lasting consequences, that one friend's poor judgment created a scar that will appear in family albums forever. Garrett's guilt and attempt at redemption through an expensive dinner is inadequate to the harm caused. The narrator's assertion that he doesn't hold anything against Garrett and hopes he learned his lesson rings hollow. How can you not hold someone responsible when their behavior nearly cost you your life? This speaks to the complex social dynamics of male friendship, where loyalty and forgiveness are expected even when genuine accountability is absent. Garrett didn't just make a mistake. He made multiple deliberate choices to antagonize a vulnerable person, and when his friend paid the price, his response was a meal at an expensive restaurant. The disproportion between harm and restitution is staggering. This story teaches us several uncomfortable truths about class, privilege, and violence. First, treating any person, regardless of their circumstances, as less than human invites catastrophic consequences. The homeless man wasn't dangerous until he was made to feel powerless and humiliated. Second, group dynamics often amplify poor decision-making. No single person in that group, except perhaps the narrator, consistently advocated for de-escalation. The presence of an audience encouraged Garrett to perform his aggression. Third, institutional responses to violence are heavily influenced by the perceived value of victims and perpetrators. A homeless man attempting to murder a college student receives less attention than the reverse scenario would warrant. Story 3 Analysis: The school infiltration plot. Our final story represents perhaps the most disturbing scenario of all, because it involves not just one troubled individual, but a coordinated group with apparent intent to cause mass harm. Sven, the isolated 7th grader who spent recess standing by the fence and wore the same outfit every day, seemed like a textbook case of a lonely child struggling with social integration. What no one realized until it was almost too late was that his isolation wasn't involuntary. It was purposeful. He was maintaining contact with people outside the school, possibly recruiting them, and planning something that required elaborate coordination and timing. Let's examine Sven's behavioral profile, because it contains warning signs that educators and parents must learn to recognize. His consistent choice of seating, always in the back corner opposite the door, isn't just preference. It's tactical positioning that allows maximum observation while minimizing his own exposure. He can see everyone who enters or exits while remaining in a position that's difficult to approach unseen. His unchanging outfit, while easy to dismiss as poverty or poor hygiene, could also represent a deliberate choice to become invisible, to be so unremarkable that people stop noticing him. When everyone expects to see you in cargo shorts and a burgundy hoodie, they stop actually looking at you. You become part of the scenery. The incident with the worms during recess is particularly significant because it demonstrates several concerning traits. First, there's the cruelty toward living creatures, one of the established markers of potential violent behavior in children. The MacDonald triad, a set of behavioral characteristics identified in childhood that are often found in the backgrounds of serial killers, includes animal cruelty alongside fire setting and bedwetting. While most children who exhibit these behaviors don't become violent criminals, their presence warrants close attention and intervention. Second, Sven was engaged in this activity during a time meant for social connection and play, suggesting he derived satisfaction from the act itself rather than from any social validation. His recess behavior, standing by the fence that bordered the woods, takes on sinister significance in light of what we learn later. Other students claim to have seen him talking to someone on the other side of the fence. The narrator dismisses these reports as potential lies, but they almost certainly weren't. Sven was maintaining regular contact with individuals outside the school grounds, likely the same people who would eventually infiltrate the building on the last day of school. This means his planning wasn't impulsive or recent. He had been cultivating these relationships and coordinating with these individuals for an extended period, possibly the entire school year. The last day of school provided perfect cover for the infiltration. With the tradition of students moving between classrooms and sitting in on different classes, the presence of unfamiliar faces was normalized. The teachers expected chaos and accepted it as part of the ritual of the year's end. This created an environment where Sven and his conspirators could operate with minimal scrutiny. The narrator notices more unfamiliar students than usual in the classroom, but even this observation doesn't trigger immediate alarm because the context makes it seem reasonable. This is exactly what the infiltrators were counting on, that the disruption of normal patterns would provide camouflage for their presence. Miss Bell's behavior is the first indication that something is wrong. Her phone call, the quiet consultation with another teacher, and the discreet removal of specific students from the classroom all suggest that some teachers had become aware of the threat, but were trying to manage it without causing panic. This is both admirable and potentially dangerous. On one hand, evacuating only the students believed to be in immediate danger prevents mass hysteria. On the other hand, it leaves other students and staff vulnerable if the situation escalates before a full evacuation can be completed. Miss Bell's lack of reaction to the fire alarm suggests it was planned, a coordinated effort to clear the building once the scope of the threat was understood. The fire alarm itself was likely triggered by administrators once they realized the extent of the infiltration. By using the standard emergency protocol, they could evacuate everyone without revealing to the infiltrators that their presence had been discovered. This was smart tactical thinking, but it also indicates that, by that point, school officials believed the threat was severe enough to warrant complete building evacuation. The presence of tools in one of the infiltrators' backpacks, tools that the narrator's parents described as very alarming, combined with the rumor about plans to set the place on fire, suggests this wasn't a prank or minor incident. This was potential mass casualty event. The police response, multiple cars and officers rushing into the building, confirms the seriousness of the threat. Law enforcement doesn't mobilize in those numbers for minor disturbances. They believed they were responding to an active threat situation, possibly with weapons involved, possibly with plans for arson or worse. The decision to dismiss school early without using buses, requiring parents to pick up their children individually, further demonstrates that authorities considered the situation unstable enough that normal dismissal procedures couldn't be followed. The revelation that Sven had led the infiltrators in through the side fence during recess is the final piece that completes the puzzle. Every strange behavior, every odd choice, every moment of isolation was part of a larger plan. Sven wasn't a lonely child struggling to fit in. He was an insider threat, someone who used his position within the school to facilitate access by dangerous outsiders. The fact that he successfully led multiple people onto school grounds through a fence during recess, presumably while other students and staff were present in the area, speaks to either remarkable boldness or catastrophic lack of supervision. What makes this case uniquely disturbing is the complete absence of information about Sven's fate and the fate of his conspirators. The narrator never saw him again, suggesting he was removed from the school system entirely. But what happened after that? Was he arrested? Was he placed in juvenile detention or psychiatric care? Were the adults he brought onto campus prosecuted? The school's efforts to keep things under wraps, while understandable from a public relations perspective, meant that students and families never received closure or full understanding of what they had narrowly escaped. From a security perspective, this case exposes multiple vulnerabilities that exist in almost every school. Perimeter security is often inadequate, relying on the assumption that students and staff will naturally notice and report strangers. But when you have hundreds or thousands of students on campus, that assumption becomes dangerous. A determined individual with help from an insider can breach most school perimeters with relative ease. Access control during unstructured times like recess is particularly challenging because supervision is spread thin and students are expected to move freely within defined areas. Sven exploited this window of opportunity, and it nearly resulted in tragedy. The psychological question that haunts this story is motivation. Why did Sven do it? What drove a 7th grader to orchestrate an infiltration of his own school? We can speculate about bullying, mental illness, ideological radicalization, or peer pressure from the older individuals he was communicating with through the fence. We might consider the possibility that he felt powerless and saw this as a way to assert control or gain notoriety. Or perhaps his home life was so traumatic that he genuinely wanted to see the school destroyed. Without more information, any explanation is just speculation. But the fact remains that children are capable of planning and executing sophisticated attacks when they have sufficient motivation and support. The impact on the narrator, who decades later still remembers the details vividly, reminds us that these events create lasting trauma even when no physical violence occurs. Every student in that school, whether they fully understood what happened or not, learned that safety is an illusion, that danger can come from unexpected sources, and that the authority figures charged with protecting them are not infallible. These lessons, absorbed in childhood, shape how people navigate the world for the rest of their lives. Comprehensive analysis, patterns, and prevention. When we examine these three stories together, disturbing patterns emerge that reveal systemic vulnerabilities in how we approach student safety and threat assessment. Each case involves a student or young person exhibiting clear warning signs that were either missed, dismissed, or inadequately addressed. Samuel Robinson was expelled but not monitored, allowing him to return to campus and continue his stalking behavior. Garrett displayed consistently aggressive behavior that his social circle normalized rather than challenged. Sven exhibited multiple red flags over an extended period, yet whatever interventions occurred were insufficient to prevent his conspiracy. The common thread is that adults and institutions failed to recognize the severity of threats until crisis points were reached. We must also acknowledge the role of social dynamics in enabling these situations. Samuel's obsession went unnoticed because schools with hundreds or thousands of students can't monitor every interaction or relationship. Garrett's friends, including the narrator, found his aggression entertaining until it resulted in violence. Sven's peers observed his strange behavior, but either didn't report it or weren't taken seriously when they did. This speaks to a broader cultural problem where we normalize certain types of concerning behavior, particularly in young men, until something catastrophic occurs. The warning signs are often visible to those around the individual long before they're visible to authority figures. The concept of the insider threat is central to understanding how to prevent incidents like Sven's school infiltration. Every organization, whether it's a school, workplace, or community center, is vulnerable to individuals who use their legitimate access to facilitate harm. Traditional security measures like locks, cameras, and visitor check-in systems are designed to prevent external threats, but they're largely ineffective against someone who already has access and knows the routines and vulnerabilities of the target environment. This is why behavioral monitoring and threat assessment teams are increasingly common in schools. They focus not just on preventing unauthorized access, but on identifying concerning behaviors among those who are already part of the community. Stalking behavior, as demonstrated in Samuel's case, follows predictable escalation patterns that mental health professionals and law enforcement have extensively documented. It typically begins with unwanted attention and attempts at contact that the perpetrator believes are romantic or friendly. When these advances are rejected, the behavior intensifies. The stalker may begin surveillance, information gathering, and increasingly intrusive attempts at communication. If these efforts continue to be rebuffed, many stalkers escalate to threats, property damage, or physical violence. Understanding this progression allows intervention at earlier stages before the behavior becomes dangerous. The challenge is that stalking behaviors exist on a spectrum, and distinguishing between awkward but harmless romantic interest and dangerous obsession isn't always straightforward. A student writing in a yearbook, even with a message that feels uncomfortable, might seem too minor to report. Following someone on social media or asking mutual friends about them could be interpreted as normal teenage behavior. It's often only in retrospect, after the behavior has escalated to clear threats or violence, that the earlier warning signs are recognized for what they were. This is why education about consent, boundaries, and appropriate relationship behaviors is so critical, not just to prevent sexual assault, but to help young people recognize when their interest in someone has crossed into problematic territory. The issue of mental illness and violence requires careful discussion because the vast majority of people with mental health conditions are not violent and are actually more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence. However, certain specific conditions, particularly when untreated and combined with substance abuse and access to vulnerable populations, do increase risk. Samuel likely suffered from a delusional disorder or obsessive attachment disorder. Sven may have had conduct disorder or early-onset personality disorder. The homeless man in the second story was clearly experiencing severe mental health crisis. In each case, their conditions weren't the sole cause of their dangerous behavior, but they were contributing factors that required professional intervention that either didn't occur or wasn't adequate. The role of family and home environment cannot be overlooked. Samuel's family apparently disappeared after the incident, suggesting instability that may have contributed to his behavior and prevented effective intervention. Sven's situation at home is unknown, but his appearance, social isolation, and eventual actions raise serious questions about what kind of support and supervision he was receiving. The homeless man's addiction and mental health issues likely stemmed from, or were exacerbated by the absence of stable housing and social support. This reminds us that individual interventions are insufficient if we don't address the broader, environmental and systemic factors that contribute to violent behavior. School security after incidents like these often focuses on physical measures, metal detectors, armed security personnel, locked doors, and controlled access points. While these measures can be effective against certain types of external threats, they do little to address the insider threat problem or the complex social and psychological factors that lead students to engage in violence. Moreover, they create environments that feel more like prisons than places of learning, potentially causing psychological harm to students who thrive in open, trusting atmospheres. The challenge is finding a balance between necessary security and maintaining an environment conducive to education and development. A more effective approach involves what security experts call behavioral threat assessment. This means training staff to recognize warning signs, creating clear reporting channels for concerning behavior, and establishing multidisciplinary teams that include mental health professionals, law enforcement, and education specialists to evaluate potential threats and intervene before violence occurs. These teams don't just wait for crises. They proactively identify students who are struggling and connect them with appropriate resources. The goal is prevention through intervention rather than response through force. Technology plays an increasingly complex role in both enabling and preventing student violence. Social media can be a platform for stalking, harassment, and coordination of violence, as we might suspect in Sven's case if he was communicating with conspirators online. However, it also creates a digital paper trail that can help identify threats and patterns of concerning behavior. Schools face difficult questions about how much monitoring of student online activity is appropriate and effective. Too little monitoring may miss critical warning signs. Too much creates privacy concerns and may push concerning behavior into harder-to-monitor spaces. The legal and ethical dimensions of threat prevention are equally complex. At what point does a student's concerning behavior justify intrusive intervention? How do we balance individual rights with collective safety? These questions don't have easy answers, and the legal framework varies significantly by jurisdiction. Expelled students like Samuel may have limited recourse if they believe they were treated unfairly, but they also retain constitutional rights that prevent certain types of monitoring or restriction. Schools must navigate these challenges while maintaining their primary obligation to keep all students safe. Practical safety, STRATGIS. Understanding the psychology and patterns of dangerous behavior is valuable, but practical knowledge of how to protect yourself and others is essential. Let's discuss concrete strategies that apply to different scenarios based on what we've learned from these stories. First and foremost, trust your instincts. Every single narrator in these stories experienced moments of discomfort or fear that they initially dismissed or minimized. When something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Your subconscious mind processes information about threat and danger far faster than your conscious mind can analyze, and that gut feeling exists for a reason. In Samuel's case, the victim knew immediately that the yearbook message was unsettling, but they rationalized it away as a weird kid being weird or an honest mistake. This is a common response to ambiguous threats, because acknowledging that someone might genuinely mean you harm is psychologically difficult and socially awkward. We're taught to give people the benefit of the doubt, to avoid overreacting, and to not cause drama. These social conditioning patterns serve us well in most contexts, but they become dangerous when dealing with actual predators. If someone makes you uncomfortable, if their attention feels intrusive or obsessive, you don't owe them explanations or second chances. You owe yourself safety. When confronted with unexpected visitors or people at your home, never open the door unless you're absolutely certain of their identity and intentions. The narrator's friends initially wanted to open the door for Samuel, perhaps out of curiosity or a misguided sense that refusing would be rude. But your home is your sanctuary, and you have no obligation to grant access to anyone ever. If someone shows up unexpectedly, especially late at night, you can speak through a locked door or window as the narrator eventually did, or you can simply not respond at all. Calling police for a suspicious person at your home isn't an overreaction. It's appropriate use of emergency services. Creating distance between yourself and potential threats is always the priority. In the second story, the group initially did this correctly by walking in a wide semicircle around the aggressive homeless man. Where they failed was in the subsequent provocations that eliminated that distance and invited retaliation. Once you've successfully disengaged from a threatening situation, stay disengaged. Don't return, don't escalate, don't attempt to prove anything. Your ego is not worth your safety. If someone is following you, don't go home. Lead them to a public place with witnesses and security, like a police station, fire station, or busy commercial area. The group's decision to eventually go home while being followed was dangerous because it revealed their address and created an opportunity for the attack that occurred. Understanding escalation dynamics is crucial. Most violent encounters don't begin with violence. They begin with words, posturing, and testing boundaries. The person who eventually becomes violent is usually assessing whether you'll resist, whether you'll call for help, and whether attacking you is worth the risk. By responding aggressively to aggression, you remove uncertainty and guarantee escalation. The appropriate response to someone exhibiting threatening behavior is to demonstrate that attacking you would be difficult and costly while simultaneously creating opportunities for escape. This might mean showing that you have your phone and are prepared to call police, moving toward witnesses or security, or verbally de-escalating while positioning yourself to flee. For students specifically, report concerning behavior early and insistently. If you know someone like Sven who exhibits warning signs, don't assume teachers or administrators are already aware. Schools are chaotic environments with thousands of interactions happening simultaneously. What's obvious to you may be completely invisible to staff. Write down specific behaviors you've observed, with dates and details if possible, and report them to school counselors, principals, or school resource officers. If your first report isn't taken seriously, report again. If your school doesn't respond appropriately, tell your parents and have them escalate. Persistence in reporting isn't tattling or snitching. It's potentially life-saving communication. Parents and guardians need to have explicit conversations with children about stalking, harassment, and consent. Many young people don't recognize stalking behaviors until they've escalated to obvious threats because they lack the framework to identify concerning patterns. Teach children that persistence in seeking unwanted attention is not romantic or flattering. It's a red flag. Someone who won't take no for an answer about small things, like accepting rejection of a friend request or invitation, won't take no for an answer about bigger things either. Healthy relationships and friendships respect boundaries. Unhealthy ones try to control or eliminate boundaries. Technology literacy is increasingly important for safety. Young people should understand that everything they post online potentially provides information to stalkers. Location tagging, check-ins, routine posting at specific times or places, and photos that show identifiable landmarks or locations all create opportunities for someone to track your patterns and whereabouts. Privacy settings on social media should be maximized, and friend or follower lists should be regularly reviewed and curated. Anyone who makes you uncomfortable should be blocked without hesitation. Many stalkers begin their information gathering through social media long before they attempt physical contact. For those who encounter aggressive or unstable individuals in public spaces, the principles of de-escalation should guide your response. Maintain calm body language and tone of voice. Give the person space and avoid cornering them or blocking their escape routes, as trapped animals and desperate people both react violently. Use simple, clear statements that acknowledge their feelings without necessarily agreeing with their position. Phrases like, "I can see you're upset," or "I understand this is frustrating," can reduce tension without escalating commitment. Your goal is to extract yourself from the situation, not to win the argument or prove you're right. Group dynamics can either enhance safety or create dangerous false confidence. In the second story, the group of 6 college students felt invulnerable because of their numbers, but this led to poor decision-making. Being in a group can absolutely deter many attackers, but it can also lead to diffusion of responsibility where everyone assumes someone else will handle the problem or make the smart decision. When you're in a group and encounter a threat, someone needs to explicitly take charge and make safety-focused decisions. Don't allow the loudest or most aggressive member to dictate strategy, because that person is often the least safety conscious. Self-defense training, whether formal classes or basic knowledge, provides both practical skills and psychological preparation. However, physical self-defense should always be a last resort when escape isn't possible. The goal is never to win a fight. The goal is to create enough space and opportunity to escape. Simple, effective techniques focus on vulnerable targets like eyes, throat, and groin, which don't require great strength or skill to strike effectively. But even more valuable than physical techniques is the mental preparation to recognize danger early and respond decisively. Most self-defense instructors emphasize that awareness and avoidance prevent far more violence than any fighting technique. Finally, after surviving a threatening encounter, seeking mental health support is crucial. All 3 narrators describe these events as memorable and impactful years later. Trauma from violence or near violence doesn't disappear on its own, and without processing, it can manifest as anxiety, hypervigilance, trust issues, or other psychological challenges. There's no shame in acknowledging that a terrifying experience affected you or in seeking professional help to process that experience. Whether through school counselors, community mental health resources, or private therapy, talking through what happened and developing coping strategies helps prevent the long-term psychological damage that violence can cause. Institutional responsibility and reform. While individual awareness and protective behaviors are important, preventing student violence ultimately requires institutional change. Schools, law enforcement, mental health systems, and communities all play roles in creating environments where warning signs are recognized and acted upon before tragedies occur. The failures evident in these 3 stories weren't primarily failures of the victims or even of any single individual. They were systemic failures that allowed dangerous situations to develop unchecked. Understanding these systemic issues is the first step toward demanding and implementing necessary reforms. School security protocols need fundamental rethinking in many districts. The traditional model of a single point of entry during school hours and locked exterior doors is insufficient when students like Sven have legitimate access and can facilitate infiltration. Schools need layered security that includes physical barriers, but also behavioral monitoring, visitor verification systems, and most importantly, adequate staffing ratios that allow teachers and administrators to actually know their students. When you have 1,000 students in a middle school, it's easy for someone like Sven to become invisible despite exhibiting concerning behaviors for an extended period. Smaller class sizes and lower student-to-staff ratios aren't just educational benefits, they're security enhancements. Expulsion, as demonstrated in Samuel's case, often creates more problems than it solves when dealing with troubled students. Removing a problematic student from one environment without ensuring they're placed in a more appropriate setting or receiving necessary treatment simply transfers the problem elsewhere. Samuel was expelled, but there was no follow-up, no monitoring, no mechanism to ensure he wasn't still a threat to his former classmates. Schools need partnerships with mental health facilities, alternative education programs, and juvenile justice systems that allow for appropriate placement of students who can't safely remain in traditional settings. Expulsion should trigger support services, not abandonment. Threat assessment teams, which some schools have implemented but many haven't, need to become universal. These teams bring together school administrators, counselors, school resource officers, mental health professionals, and sometimes outside law enforcement to evaluate concerning behaviors and determine appropriate interventions. They don't just respond to immediate threats. They identify students on concerning trajectories and intervene early with support services before crisis points are reached. Training for teachers and staff must go beyond recognizing obvious threats to understanding subtle warning signs and concerning patterns. A student who sits in the same spot every day wearing the same clothes might seem unremarkable, but when combined with animal cruelty, social isolation, and regular positioning by an exterior fence, these behaviors paint a concerning picture. Teachers need framework and language to discuss these observations without feeling like they're overreacting or unfairly targeting students. Clear reporting protocols and protection from retaliation for good faith reporting are essential. The intersection of homelessness, mental illness, and public safety, as highlighted in the second story, reveals how broader social failures create dangerous situations. Cities and communities that criminalize homelessness while defunding mental health services and affordable housing create desperate populations with nothing to lose. This doesn't excuse violence, but it does explain why antagonizing vulnerable people in crisis situations creates disproportionate danger. Adequate mental health resources, housing-first initiatives, and compassionate approaches to addiction treatment aren't just social justice issues. They're public safety issues that affect everyone. Conclusion. These three stories represent a tiny fraction of the violence and near violence that occurs in schools and communities every day. For every Samuel, Garrett, and Sven, there are thousands of others exhibiting similar patterns, following similar trajectories toward potentially catastrophic outcomes. Some will be stopped before anyone is hurt, others won't. The difference often comes down to luck, but it doesn't have to. We have the knowledge, tools, and resources to identify and intervene with troubled individuals before they become violent. What we often lack is the will to prioritize prevention over response, support over punishment, and uncomfortable conversations over willful ignorance. If you're a student and you recognize yourself in any of these stories, whether as a potential victim noticing concerning behavior from others or as someone whose own thoughts and behaviors are starting to alarm you, reach out for help now. Talk to school counselors. Call mental health hotlines or confide in trusted adults. The path from troubled teenager to violent criminal isn't inevitable. Intervention works, but only when people are willing to admit they need it and accept it when offered. There's no shame in struggling with anger, obsessive thoughts, or violent fantasies. There is shame in knowing you need help and refusing to seek it until someone gets hurt. If you're a parent, have explicit conversations with your children about all of this. Don't assume schools are handling it or that your child would tell you if something was wrong. Create an environment where reporting concerning behavior is expected and praised, where your child feels comfortable telling you about the kid at school who seems potentially dangerous or about their own concerning thoughts if they're experiencing them. Monitor your child's online activity not as punishment but as protection. Know their friends, know their routines, and be present in their lives enough to notice when something changes. If you're an educator or administrator, advocate loudly for the resources your school needs to keep students safe. Push for threat assessment teams, adequate counseling staff, and training for recognizing warning signs. Create reporting systems that are easy to use and actually result in action. When students or staff report concerns, take them seriously even when they seem minor or ambiguous. Don't wait for certainty to intervene. Better to overrespond to a misunderstanding than underrespond to an actual threat. For policymakers and community leaders, fund mental health services, support education at levels that allow for appropriate staffing ratios, and create systems that don't simply shuffle dangerous individuals between institutions without providing actual treatment or support. Recognize that school security isn't just about metal detectors and police officers. It's about creating communities where people have support systems, where mental illness is treated rather than criminalized, and where violence is prevented through intervention rather than responded to after the fact. The stories you've heard today are terrifying, but they're also instructive. Every failure they represent is an opportunity to do better, to create safer schools and communities through awareness, action, and commitment to prioritizing safety over comfort or convenience. Don't let these cautionary tales be forgotten. Share this video with parents, educators, students, and anyone who might benefit from understanding these patterns and dangers. Comment below with your own experiences or observations. The more we discuss these issues openly, the harder it becomes for dangerous individuals to operate unnoticed. Thank you for watching and stay safe out there.